Oh, I have to stop yawning. Okay. Cool. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I kind of already talked about the concept of this lecture, so we're going to talk about not white feminism. And I say that in jest. We're going to talk about many different types of feminism and theories of identities and what that might look like. I think that we'll start with Judith Butler and Essentialism and talk a little bit about trans versus cis and things like that. And then we'll go from there. We'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about matrices of domination and Black feminism and intersectionality. Then we'll talk about third world feminism, post-colonial feminism. And then we will talk about, we're also talking a little bit about Chicana feminism. And that's all that I have on my list, but we can totally talk about other things if there are other things that interest you. This could be like a whole college course and not, you know, a 50-minute lecture. So some of you were in my lecture earlier this week, I believe it was. But first, we should probably talk about like concepts of gender. Who can tell me what gender is? What does gender mean?
I mean, sometimes there are lots of definitions of gender. Sometimes gender is what people or like society tells you should be, and sometimes gender is like personal identity.
Yeah, so earlier this week we talked about like the gender umbrella, right? So when we talk about things like gender studies, there's a lot of different things that make up what our gender is. Some people think it's just biological sex. I think we're kind of, you know, advanced beyond that point where we think that's what it is. But I think it becomes very difficult to understand and know what it means when we're creating like static interpretations. So I think in general, what most of the people that we're talking about today would rely upon would be like individuals, identity and their performance externally, aka how they choose to identify themselves or how they identify themselves as opposed to how society has dictated. Sometimes those two things don't mesh together, and that's often when problems occur or when criticisms that we then look at are discussed because society is dictating what we as individuals should be looking at or should be doing or should be saying. So first with Essentialism, Judith Butler, who, you know, is an amazing human being and writes like all the books, wrote a book in about 92 called Gender Trouble. And this was actually one of her very first books, if not her first book. And this book focused on conceptions of when we conflate biological sex, male, female, etc., with our gender identity, man, woman, and that with masculine and feminine characteristics. So we often attribute feminine characteristics to women, masculine characteristics to men. We talk about what it means to be a woman, right? When we're talking about like feminine characteristics, we're talking about passivity, we're talking about being emotional, caring, mothering, etc. And her critique was when we conflate those things, that is particularly problematic because it excludes people that do not identify with those identities and with those things. So her critique was that we should not be conflating male, female with man, woman. Man, woman is a gender identity that we perform, and that those other characteristics are also not things that we should look at because those particularly are things that that are performed and fluid when we have static interpretations of what gender might be. That is when people are ultimately excluded from society. And that was what she wrote about in Gender Trouble, what she also wrote about in Undoing Gender. She wrote that book a couple years later, and kind of goes from there. Butler writes a lot about a lot of things. She kind of always goes back to these theories of gender, but she also certainly writes other books now. So you may have also heard her in other concepts. So I think that is particularly important and probably the cornerstone of a lot of different things when it comes to queer theory. So what might queer theory mean? Anyone? What's queer theory? There are no wrong answers. It is boring when it's just
maybe authors talking about like how kind of similar to how Judith Butler is talking about, like they queer theories, maybe authors about they're talking about different interpretations of sexuality and how it's performed.
Yeah, so like Butler talks about this stuff first. Butler, yep, are kind of the two first main authors, but that people would say that that's where queer theory came from, right? It's this critique of static notions of identity, this problematizing assumptions of a heteronormative environment, and what that then might look like. So that all comes from Essentialism and all comes from Butler. When we are also talking about this, we would also can talk about things like trans feminism. And by this, I don't mean transnational feminism, because we'll talk about that later, but trans feminism would be a transgender versus cisgender discussion. So what are the distinctions between those two? What does it mean to be cisgender?
Like identifying and performing according to a gender that was assigned at birth.
Yes, yes. So cisgender is someone that performs and identifies as the same gender that society says that they are, right? So it's an agreement between societal constructions and your identity. There are things also like cis privilege. So a great example is if I were to walk into a women's restroom, no one would look twice about it, right? I perform as, identify as a woman, and society doesn't seem to have a problem with that type of thing. And so I think that's a really good example of one of cis privilege when we would talk about things like that. So a lot of trans feminists talk about what it means perhaps to be a woman, what those privileges look like, and then where they would fit in and what that would look like. Does anyone have questions about essentialism before we move on? Cool. So we're now going to talk about but we're now going to move into Black feminism. Again, it's like a broad strokes. These all could be their own majors. So Black feminism is founded upon the assumption that patriarchy and white supremacy are inextricably linked. That the two main things, right? One is patriarchy and white supremacy are inextricably linked, that whiteness almost always informs patriarchy. Two, that because of that, the way that Black women interact with the world, experience life, experience oppression is vastly different than that of a white woman. So my own social location as a white woman would be a very different experience than that of a Black woman. And while there are some commonalities between the two, there are fundamental differences. So Patricia Hill Collins is one of the first to write about this. And she wrote about the matrix of domination or the matrix of oppression. It's a sociological paradigm that explains issues of oppression that deal with race, class, and gender, which, though recognized as different social classifications, are all interconnected. She wrote this in, that wasn't her book. Maybe it was her book. So yes, she wrote this in Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. Sorry, I had to second guess myself there. So her argument or her concept is that the way our place in the world informs the way we interact with others and the way we experience oppression. So a good example of that, or at least that tension that would exist, is I have never been followed around in a grocery store. I am white, right? So I experience white privilege and what that might look like. That would not be the same for a Black woman or even a Black man. However, the argument would be that that Black woman would still be experiencing instances of oppression differently. Another really good example is when we talk about things like medical care. Black women were assumed to experience pain or have higher tolerances of pain, and they were less likely to get pain medication, and different things like that. And so these intersections or different facets of our identity then informs the way we engage in dominant systems. While some of these may overlap, right, it always creates a unique makeup. The characteristics such as race, age, and sex may affect people in different ways. Geography also plays a role in this, and throughout like time, right? So like my ancestors would have experienced patriarchy differently than I do, type concept. Other types of Black feminism that we're going to talk about is, so we had Matrices of Domination with Patricia Hill Collins. Crenshaw also talks about this. She talks about it as the concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality is intersections of identities. So it's a very identical concept to Patricia Hill Collins, just different verbiage. And intersectionality talks particularly about our various social locations. So Hooks then kind of jumps into the foray here and says that our different social locations, so where we are in society, where we are spatially located on these intersections, informs our life. A good example of this is when we talk about things like the wage gap, right? Women make 55 cents to the dollar of men. But if we were to put that in context of white men and women of color, the difference is drastic, and it's actually more like 35 cents to the dollar. And so those discrepancies create a much more informed narrative of how the matrices of domination and these intersections of oppression interplay with various aspects of life. When we talk about things like the glass ceiling, so we talk about breaking barriers, right? Have we heard of the glass ceiling before? So when we talk about things like that, we talk about breaking barriers, but the concept of the glass ceiling is almost always only written in the context of white women. When in actuality, when we're talking about women of color, it's often called like concrete walls, right? That breaking through becomes much harder to do because of the various power structures that exist. And so I think that's always a really interesting discussion in terms of what patriarchy looks like for various people. And you'll see that as a very similar thread to all of this, right? When people that were in my previous lecture, we talked about like women's suffrage, and we talked about the second wave of feminists, a lot of that came from places of privilege. They had the agency, they had the ability, they had the freedom to do those things. And that was almost always because they were white. And so talking about that in context, I think is particularly important. When we look at women's movements, they've essentially been whitewashed, right? The only focus becomes on like Susan B. Anthony, and we don't talk about other aspects of that history. Other notable Black feminists that are really awesome that you should look at. Like I said, Patricia L. Collins, Crenshaw, Bell Hooks is absolutely amazing. Probably one of my favorites. Audre Lorde is amazing. She writes really great stuff. She was a poet also, so her essays are really short. And I think they're really, so much of feminist literature is very easy to consume. It's written with activist notions in mind more often than not. So it's, I don't want to say simple, like it's not amazing work, but it's so much easier to read, consume, appreciate than like Baudrillard nonsense that you have to read 12 times. And so I highly recommend any of these. If afterwards you ever want to email me for reading suggestions, probably one of my favorite things ever. Audre Lorde wrote a really great essays about the master's tools and the master's house. I'm sure we've heard those phrases before in debate, right? You cannot break down the master's house with the master's tool type thing. And she wrote a really great essay about breaking silence. So women being conditioned to be silent and what that might look like. Questions about that before I move on?
Can you put the author's name in the chat? I'm not sure how to spell some of them.
Oh, totally. I'm sorry.
Thank you. You're good.
We have Hooks, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, who else did I say? I think that's everyone that I said so far. Angela Davis is also an amazing one. There's also really interesting literature that talks about the nuance of Black feminism in the context of like Black patriarchy and what that might look like, and these conceptions of being forced to choose, right? And that was one of Hooke's primary criticisms and her discussions about intersectionality. So movements oftentimes force people to align or choose specific aspects of their identity while ignoring other aspects, and being like, you can either be a feminist or you can be, you know, part of the civil rights movement, but you cannot be both. And she had a fundamental criticism of that. All right, so the next section is about third world feminism. So third world feminism is really interesting. So this is almost primarily in the context of like as a response to feminist international relations, or FemIR, but it's also just kind of a response to larger feminist movements as they were happening across the globe. So third world feminism is often also called post-colonial feminism. The two I would not say are specifically interchangeable, but are very similar. There are reasons why people are like third world feminism is a bad phrase. Why might that be? Why is it bad to say third world?
Maybe it sounds really foreign and they kind of classify it from our world. So maybe people would not, because of this phrase, people would not be familiar with this type of feminism.
Yes, that's true. What else? Why are you saying third world bad? Not even third world feminism, just third world. Donna, go for it.
Okay, I think in a lot of contexts, people use like third world, and like when they think of it, they think of like, I guess like poor or like not as good as like a
Yes.
first world country. So
Yes. So like we don't even use that verbiage now, right? We say like developing and developed countries. Third world feminism creates this conception of dirt huts, no internet, in the middle of rainforest type concepts, when one, that's not actually the case. Two, it's still all the same world necessarily. It is not less than, it is just a difference. There are some people that disagree. So Ranju Sudu-Her argues that third world feminism is reclaimed, highlighting the importance of local national in order to promote inclusive and democratic feminism that accommodate diverse and multiple feminist perspectives. Mohanty and Spivak are two big post-colonial feminist authors. When they initially started writing, it was third world feminism. And that was also just kind of rhetoric of the international community at that time in the concept. And third world feminism or post-colonial feminism, I think, is a very large umbrella of literature that talks about nuances of situations based upon various people's social locations that are not white women. So when we look at, again, cornerstones of feminist movements, which almost exclusively focused on white or American or European women. And so there is this discussion of what that looks like. A really good example is that when we're talking about stuff like hunger strikes, right? That was a key part of activism during the women's suffrage movement. But that assumed an instance of privilege where food was readily available and these people were not already like not having access to food or malnourished and things like that. And so that concept, I think, then is really important when we then talk about feminism abroad and outside of the United States and not white feminism, what that would look like. So Mohanty says that some of Western feminist discourses on third world feminism categorize third world women as homogenous unitary groups, regardless of their diverse multiple struggles and histories against racism, sexism, and colonialism. So again, right, that we assume that it's this binary of white women and everyone else, when Mohanty and Spivak are criticizing not only the conception that all methods of activism should be the same, that all methods of activism need to be these huge, overarching, broad stroke types of activism, but also that priorities are the same, right? That priorities of feminists in the United States are the exact same as that of feminists in another country. And that concept, I think, is also one that Mohanty and Spivak criticize. I think a really great example of this is when we talk about something like Islamic feminism. First, the notion that something like Islam could in and of itself be feminist. But second is whether or not something like wearing a hijab is liberating for the person wearing it, right? So there are fascinating Islamic feminists that talk about how wearing something like a hijab or dressing in a certain way frees them from being sexualized and objectified in our current society. And it frees them from the male gaze. Versus women in the United States wearing two-piece bikinis or halter tops or crop tops or things like that, right? That feminists in the United States might say that their dress is in fact liberating because they're able to wear what they want regardless of the male gaze. Versus someone who is wearing a hijab and wants to wear it is saying no, that is what frees them from the male gaze, and that in itself is feminist in nature. And I think that fundamental discussion then comes down to one of agency and one of freedom, and notions of what that looks like. But I think that when we then go to enact these things, that is when the nuance and that is when the difference occurs. Both types of feminists would say patriarchy is bad, would say that women should have agency, but what that translates into, I think, is something different. According to Mohanty, it's not justifiable to classify third world women as homogenous groups. Analyzing women's situations by using intersectionality allows third world feminists to emphasize the complex interrelationships between anti-racism, anti-colonialism, political struggles, etc. If we take, for example, different types of women in different countries, they're almost always informed by Euro-American hegemony and colonialism. Things like the inheritance of slavery or enforced migration, things like that are not discussed when we are talking about white feminism, but are certainly something that plays into the broader narrative of what it means to be a woman. Another really good example is when we talk about something like sanctions, right? When we talk about something like sanctions as a political tool to force countries to do something, we do not then take into consideration that women are often the ones first affected by sanctions, and why and what that might look like. The alternative or these activism moments for post-colonial and third world feminism is often a rewriting of history based upon specific contexts of background struggles, day-to-day strategies of survival. There's some amazing books. There's Colonize This, which is great. Literally Anything by Mohanty and Spivak. Oh, and I'm so sorry, Elena,
Elena.
Elena, I'm sorry. I just saw your question. We can jump back to that in 2 seconds.
Sounds good.
So there are many other types of post-colonial authors, post-colonial feminists, but I think those are two of the big ones. The other thing that they criticize is that Mohanty says that white feminists use an arithmetic method in terms of like the frequency of events measures oppression. So singular instances perhaps are not a thing that matter as much as frequency of that type of oppression then becoming a big deal. Mohanty uses a lot of anti-colonial rhetoric as well. So she uses a lot of Bolbeck's theory of colonialism and talks about how we engage in this binary process of backwardness versus modernization, because colonized populations are not, you know, as developed as the colonizer. We are then forced to reevaluate the ways feminism are practiced and vary during those through those women's colonial positions. So it is an act of colonialism for white feminists to assume and to act on that other various groups are backwards or behind the times, etc., particularly when dealing with women's issues. Do we have questions about this? No. Cool. So we can talk about Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. Who is Anita Hill?
she testified against Clarence Thomas when he was being, I guess, during his hearing in front of the Senate to be a Supreme Court justice. And she said he like sexually harassed her, but then no one kind of believed her.
So, yes, I think Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, I think, are two really good examples. One of just, the problem with the United States and sexual assault laws, et cetera, in general. But I think it's a particularly interesting discussion when it comes to things like Black feminism, right? So what does it mean to speak out against what would be the first Black man on the Supreme Court? And she was demonized for doing so because it was seen as an attack on what would have been a revolutionary step for Black liberation in general, right? That this step. And there are people that thought that she shouldn't have spoken out because of those things. That tension, I think, elucidates the nuances of what Black feminists would talk about when talking about the various matrices of domination or intersections of oppression and how those would look on our world, right? You're either a feminist or you're part of the civil rights movement. You're not both type of concept, which I think is really important. Do you have other questions? The next type of feminism we're going to talk about is transnational feminism. Transnational feminism comes out of the umbrella of post-colonial feminism. The difference is, one, transnational feminists have been writing in the past like 5 or 6 years. Two is post-colonial feminism is focused on individual narratives of individual women in countries across the world and how individual activism looks differently. Transnational feminism takes that a step further and says, while there is individual women's stories and narratives throughout the world, we must then embrace that difference and come together as a singular movement. So it's this tension that feminist movements particularly, I think it has plagued feminist movements, is what does it mean to be a feminist? What does that mean in the context of other aspects of our identities? And what does that mean for the broader strokes? If I am campaigning for the right to choose, if we were talking about abortion rights, how does that interact if I were raised Catholic? And those different discussions when it comes to movements and activism and things like that. When we talk about particularly things like Chicana feminism, a lot of that is talked about. Chicana feminism is focused on Mexican American feminists and then Mexican feminists in general. And there's a particular focus on various female archetypes in Mexican culture, particularly religious archetypes. So like the Virgin of Guadalupe and things like that, and what that then looks like for the sexual and bodily agency for women in that culture, right? So these archetypes of what a woman is supposed to mean as dictated by our culture. And we see archetypes like this across very many cultures and how that might affect our agency. A very fascinating intersection is feminism and religion. what does that look like? Does aspects of religion, are those inherently patriarchal? Is it just the implementation of those aspects of religion, and what that then might look like?
Oh, I know sometimes there's one story, I don't know if it's Catholicism or Christianity, where I believe this one king he was really abusive to a woman, so she cut off his hair, which is like a symbol of his wealth, and she took all his land, which I know sometimes not all religion is feminist, but I know that one story, it's like my favorite one. I believe her name was Delilah too.
That's fair. And I think it's a really good example, right? There's nuances to all of this, and there's like facets of perhaps feminist ideology within broader spectrums or broader paintings or narratives of literature. The last one that I had planned to talk about, and then we can talk about whatever you all would like, is Indigenous feminism. So Indigenous feminism is mainly in the United States. It also might refer to various groups in like Canada, but Indigenous feminism is an intersectional theory of feminism and coloniality in the context of Indigenous women. The concept is that Indigenous women can be empowered by their own culture and cultural values rather than mainstream white patriarchal ones. This cultural perspective would place an emphasis on Indigenous culture as a method to combat white patriarchy. And there's a lot of Indigenous feminists that would say that patriarchy and white patriarchy, well, I feel like those are probably synonymous, exist because of colonization. And so a return and an emphasis on Indigenous culture and construction would seek to relieve these cultures and these communities from problems. I think this one is particularly unique in that attribution of patriarchy and whiteness as being kind of one and the same. There is a lot of emphasis on Indigenous persons in the United States, as well as First Persons in Canada, as being kind of the two big bodies of literature on this. There is some in Australia, but not a whole lot, and probably fundamentally different than that of United States and Canada. There's various things that they've done so far. There's a movement right now focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous women. So what the lack of focus on these missing humans and what that might look like has been a cornerstone of activism for these people and for these groups. What questions do you have about what I've talked about, and or is there something that you wanted to talk about that we didn't?
What type of feminism we talked about is more adopted by feminism case?
All of it. So I think, and I think this is just true of debate in general, right? Is I think there is an attribution to focus on small subsets or nuances of these various theories as ways to win debate rounds, which is totally fine, right? Like debate's a competitive game, probably a good thing. I think it depends upon the context. So I think what ends up happening is we see a lot of these various groups of thought, movements, etc., as ways that we see various topics, right? So like on immigration, there were certainly different feminist critiques than there was on like the education topic, which is like feminist pedagogy would have been on the education topic versus what would happen on the arms sales topic, where like MIR was probably a thing, critiques of violence were probably a thing, right? This mechanism in which we focus on state-to-state violence is inherently patriarchal and masculine, that we're only focusing on these overt wars, a la like Cuomo, who's a feminist. Then I think on this topic in particular, we'll see a lot of like feminist jurisprudence, Black feminism, gender abolition, right? And I think it's informed by these various topics. I think with, and one of like the beautiful things about feminism is I think regardless of the topic or the resolution, there is a type of feminist schools of thought that would apply to that.
Thank you.
Of course.
I have like personally never seen Chicana feminism within debate. How would that work? And how would that at all like fit into the topic? Because to me, it seems like an area kind of ignored by mainstream debate.
To a certain extent, I think it is. I might be showing my age. When Cal State Fullerton had a particularly amazing first-round team a while ago that did a lot of like Chicana feminism stuff, actually. I think it depends again on the topic, right? So I think that would have perhaps been really applicable on the immigration topic. These discussions of like being whitewashed and what it meant to be an American versus what it meant to be Chicana, or even, you know, Latin American feminism and what that looks like. But I think it depends. I don't know, and don't, I don't think that Chicana feminism in general is a very good critique of the criminal justice system, because it is a cultural movement focused on the tensions within like Chicana culture and Mexican culture, and what that looks like for a woman's agency. Other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering about this earlier, but like when you said that whenever we put sanctions on other countries, women are the first ones to be affected, like why is that?
It comes back to the concept of like women working double jobs too, right? So women have the responsibility in almost every culture of not only perhaps working outside of the home, but also taking care of the home and taking care of the family, right? Like that's what society has determined. So when things like sanctions happen, children are always, you know, fed first when food becomes scarce. So even outside of sanctions, so if food becomes scarce, children are fed first, and women are the ones that often take a back seat and are fed last in those contexts. And I think sanctions is an example, but I think it's more so a question about like food scarcity. Does that make sense? If the woman is the carer of the home, while when that food becomes scarce, it is her job to care for the group at large.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What other questions did y'all have, or was there something we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about?
I guess I have another one. I've heard black feminism described as like a super performative kind of critique that's really, really nuanced. And I think my question is, for like a flex debater, what kind of Ks would you recommend versus like someone who's more into performance and other kinds of K debate, I guess?
That's a good question. So I would not say that any type of feminism lends itself more to like performativity versus non-performativity, or performativity versus like flex debate, etc. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's more so a question of what, how you are choosing to enact the alternative. So I would probably say it's conflation to be like Black feminists are performative, whereas like FemIR is not. I don't necessarily think that FemIR lends itself well to performance, but I think there's certainly instances where it could, or what that might look like, right? That poetry, etc. I think it's more of a question of what solvency advocates you have and what you want to make your debate rounds. And I think that's ultimately the fundamental question, right? Is what do you want to make your debate rounds, and then go from there in this larger context of what various types of advocacies and arguments and movements would then look like. I mean, on the education topic, I was surfing Amazon for, because online window shopping, and found a book called Lucia the Luchadora, who was about this girl on a playground, and it was like this whitewashing education argument. And so that became our affirmative for a couple of tournaments, right? Like reading this story and this storybook, which I think is particularly a good example of you can make arguments out of anything. It's just a question of what you want to do, what you think is the most strategic. Are there other questions?
I don't know how related this is, but can you talk a little bit about Poir's notion of like the queer suicide bomber? I don't know if it intersects with like feminist lit, but
I mean, it does in the sense, so like the good example, right, is it was women's studies first in colleges, and then it became gender studies and like gender and queer studies, right? I think they're all inextricably linked. They're all discussions of patriarchy and domination and things like that. It's just a question of how that is implicated. Poir is amazing. Highly recommend reading her. She don't like her most recent book as much as I like her other two, but she talks about homonationalism. So the argument is that we have normalized aspects of of queer identities as a way to incorporate it and consume it into our society, right? Homonationalism is then that there are the example that she would use is something like same-sex marriage, right? It's becoming normalized. So we have this characteristic or identity of what it means to be a citizen and what that citizen would then look like for the broader scheme of things. Her argument, which talks about queer suicide bombing particularly, is when we began or continued, some would say, wars in the Middle East, we began to sexualize that violence in a way that made it consumable to our society. And the example she uses is photos at like Abu Ghraib, where we engaged in sexualizing behavior of prisoners in a way that demonized them, dehumanized them, etc. Queer suicide bombing is a performative alternative, not like you have to sing a song or something, but it's an alternative of homonationalism as a way to break down those sexualized constructions that made it consumable and that violence consumable to our society. Does that make sense?
yeah, thank you.
Of course. Her first book, which is like Transgression, is really good. Hold on, I'm gonna find it for you. Am I really that? It's really Terrorist Assemblages. That's what it's called. That book's really great. It's a fairly easy read, and it's a really good alternative discussion of international relations critiques. Do y'all have other questions?
Will you just put the name of that book in the chat?
Oh, of course.
Thank you.
If you all don't have any other questions, you have like 4 minutes till your next lecture, so I'm more than happy to let you go. Maybe stand up from your computer for a second. If you have any questions at all or any recommendations on reading, there is my email address. You are more than welcome to email me. But thank you all so much. Hope you enjoyed yourself. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.